Daniel Robert Wolfe is a British-Canadian historian. He served as the 20th Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, a position to which he was appointed in 2009. He was reappointed to a second term as Queen's Principal early in 2013. He recently stepped down from the position after 10 years to return to full-time teaching and research in Queen's History Department. Dr. Wolfe's research has focused on two areas: early modern British intellectual and cultural history and the global history of historical writing. He's the author of 5 books and co-editor of several others, including the 2-volume A Global Encyclopedia of Historical Writing, his 2003 monograph, The Social Circulation of the Past, won the John Ben Snow Prize of the North American Conference on British Studies in 2004 for the best book on British history pre-1800. His most recent books, both published in 2011, are the co-edited volumes 3 and 5 of the 5-volume Oxford History of Historical Writing, a series of which he was general editor, and 2 sole-authored 1-volume histories of historiography. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Great to be here.
We are interested in your hobby. Is it more than a hobby?
I would say it is a little bit more than a hobby because it directly relates to my job as a history professor.
And that's book collecting of Elizabethan books?
I would say a little broader than Elizabethan. I would say anything roughly from the late 15th through the 18th century, and sometimes I stray a little further ahead, but that core area is I would say the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. Again, I've got a few Victorian things and some early 20th century things, but I would say the core of the collection is the 16th and 17th centuries.
Okay. Before we get into the specifics on that, let's go back to your early life and the beginning of your relationship with books. How did that get started?
Well, I suppose my relationship with books started the way most people's did, as in your parents. They read you, and then eventually you learn to read yourself. And I'm told I was a fairly avid reader as a child, and so I've always liked them. And because I was always interested in history, I actually started collecting rare books at a relatively early age.
That was my next question.
Okay, well, I bought my first one I remember very specifically, in the summer of 1981 when I was a graduate student in Oxford. It's a book I still have. It's an early edition of the complete works of Ben Jonson, the Jacobean and Caroline poet and dramatist.
What was the bookstore?
I think, but I'm not absolutely certain, that it was either Robin Waterfield's or Thornton's, both in Oxford. I immediately gave it to my parents for what was then their 25th wedding anniversary, and there it stayed until they died, whereupon it came back to me and is sitting up on the shelf.
Why did you buy that particular volume?
Well, because my parents were very, very sort of, they're British, and also my mother was an English professor part-time at the University of Winnipeg with an interest in 17th century prose and poetry. And, the Jonson looked like it fit the bill. My dad's interests were a little bit different, but I guess I catered more to mums in that case. But they were very pleased. They were very pleased to have it. But my very first book that I owned for myself was actually 2 books, one of which I still have, and the other of which I don't. Part of the collection that I gave to our library, which we'll talk about, I'm sure.
So, what was it about that particular volume that attracted your attention?
The Jonson volume, I think just simply because it would have interested my mother as an English professor and somebody who, although most of her interest was in 20th century American and early 20th century British, she had dabbled in the 17th century and in fact actually taught a lot of 17th century Milton and so forth. So I thought Buck Johnson was as good a 25th anniversary present as I could find.
Was it beautifully bound, or was it an early edition?
I would say it was probably not particularly beautifully bound. I mean, it was clearly a modern binding, but with a nice label on the spine and so forth. At that point, I didn't know nearly as much about the provenance and binding and so forth of old books as I came to. I was actually just at the outset, really, of my doctoral studies at that point, and had yet to spend the many hours I would spend in Duke Humphrey's library at the Bodleian in Oxford, literally handling rare books from my period. So it was just, I think, the title and the subject, I think.
You wanted to please your mother.
Yeah, I wanted to please my parents, and I think my mother in particular, after years as a child of, buying them, Mountie ashtrays and for anniversary presents. 25 was a big deal, I thought. So
Sure.
They actually made it to 56 before the first parent died. But I do want to go on to say that it did sort of pique my interest, that and then spending 2 more years working with this stuff in the Bodleian, and actually maybe acquiring some of these myself.
So that was the thing, is there's handling them, and then there's this desire to own, to acquire. Like, why did that set in?
Possession, yeah. I think it set in almost by accident, in that I was on the point of leaving the UK in the spring of 1984 to return to Canada and come back to Queen's as a postdoctoral fellow. And, while you're over there for 4 years, you acquire certain things like a bicycle and other things that you're obviously not going to transport back. So I was selling stuff. And a fellow graduate student of mine, who still hadn't finished his thesis, desperately needed an electronic typewriter. And I had one. It wasn't going to work in Canada, so I sold it to him. And he was very, very short on funds, so he asked if he could trade 2 rare books he had to me, and I felt a little bit guilty, but he was quite insistent that he was more than happy to part with them to get the typewriter.
So they were worth quite a bit more than a typewriter.
Well, that would be my view, but I didn't argue too hard about it, and it was a high-end typewriter, but. So I'm sure it served him well, but I'm sure it's also long gone, whereas the books are still in existence. I still have one of them, which is an early edition of Thomas Hobbes's translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. The other one was an edition of Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, and that one I no longer have. It didn't actually fit the collection when the collection started growing, so I actually gave it to our library here, as of course I have with several other things, but those were the first 2 that I actually bought and owned.
And so what? It just felt really good to own it, or what was it?
Well, it was partly that it was, hey, great, this is a 350-year-old book, and it is mine.
Yeah.
A bit of a sense with these very old books that even though you pay money for them, you never really do own them. You're really the steward of them, because they were around 300 odd years ago, and all being well, they'll still be around 300 years from now. But there was a very practical element to this, in that I am a historian of historiography, and the Hobbes book was a early English translation of one of the great Greek classical histories, Thucydides' late 5th century history of the war between Athens and Sparta. And so it was directly relevant to my own writing. My doctoral thesis was about early 17th century historians of their past.
Yeah, so exactly what does not that we need to spend a lot of time on it, but what's historiography?
That's a really good question, and in fact, there's a number of different definitions of it. I would say you can use the word in several different ways. And one will talk about the historiography of a particular period or a particular subject. For example, the historiography of the French Revolution or the historiography of, the fall of the Roman Empire. And that basically means reviewing what modern historians and perhaps slightly earlier historians have said about that particular issue. So debates. Second way it's used is often to refer to historical method. So departments of history will often offer a undergraduate course, sometimes even a graduate course called historiography, which is really a course on historical methods.
How to be a historian.
How to be a historian. I'm actually not a super fan of those, and any time I've taught historiography, and I've taught it a lot at 4 different places, I've tended to avoid that, partly because I'm very much a pluralist on historical method.
What does that mean?
Well, it just means I don't think that there is a definitive way to be a historian, there are various different methods.
Sure.
And in fact, the reason I feel that really has to do with the third meaning of the term historiography, which I would call the history of history. And that's the one I do. And because I treat history as a subject to be historicized itself, the story of its development to be told, chronologically as well as thematically, I see that it was not always the way it has been for the last 150, 200 years. There have been a lot of changes.
So you study how historians study?
I study how they study and how they wrote about the past.
Because your dissertation identified, for example, the study of antiquarian books and manuscripts as being legitimate history themselves. Is that right?
Well, it was one of the theses to the thesis, if you like, was that in England in the early 17th century, for the very first time, the concept that a narrative history could include more than kings and battles and major events actually came to pass, particularly in the work of a early 17th century lawyer, politician, and legal scholar called John Selden, who wrote in 1618 a book called The History of Tithes. Tithes being the tenth that you pay of the produce of your land to the church every year. And Selden was a little bit of an anti-clerical, and he wanted to expose the myth that this was, divinely ordained, was in the Bible and so forth, and showed that the practice of giving tithes was actually historically based, and there had been changes, it was not immemorial, and so forth. And it caused a huge controversy. It was censored. The king commanded him not to engage in controversies with his critics. But the important thing from my point of view is that it was a history of tithes,
right,
of a thing and not a king. And that was a real first for the 17th century, at least in England. The French had already done this. There were many French scholars in the mid to late 16th century who were doing a kind of social and cultural history based on antiquities and not simply on events. But this was the first for an English historian.
So what did he do? He went and got a whole bunch of tithes? Like what? Like
no, he just looked through the records. He looked through
That's what I mean.
Chronicles,
yes, exactly.
and Chronicles, and looked at how the law had changed and when these came in, and found that it was not actually a matter of quote unquote divine law or even ecclesiastical law,
right,
but really a kind of a common law practice that had crept up over the centuries, and that the church and the clergy were clinging to this as a kind of divine right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So he was looking at the material record.
That's right.
And then and coming up with some and using that to come up with an argument.
He was doing what we would now regard as, I would say, as a very empirical examination and a chronologically empirical examination of the historical record on this subject, instead of proceeding from an assumption and then just documenting selectively behind that assumption.
And this was new for England.
This was relatively new because he appears relatively late in my thesis and in the first monograph I wrote, which was largely based on the thesis. Most of the rest of it concerned what I would call more conventional narrative historians. William Camden, who's a really interesting figure because he actually did a lot of antiquarian research. He was actually perhaps one of the great fathers of English antiquarianism, writing a massive book called the Britannia, which was full of the local history of towns and counties and so forth. And he also wrote a history of Queen Elizabeth's reign after she had died. But the interesting thing is, he never connected the two. In fact, he insisted when he was writing the Britannia, the antiquarian work, that it was not a history, even though it was absolutely full of historical details. So he couldn't make that jump. It took Selden, who was a generation and a bit younger, to make that leap.
Okay, so how did all of this inform your collecting then?
Well, I decided that because I was still working on the subject, and in fact I've never really left the subject, although my interests have, I guess, evolved to include more global history of history, not simply England. I decided that given that I was moving back to Canada, and that we were well shy of having the internet or anything like that, really, if I was going to continue to work in the field, and not be dependent on trips to major rare book libraries, then I was going to need a few copies of these things myself.
So what things?
These classic history books from the 17th century.
Right, so you were collecting history books from those times.
Exactly.
And what? It seems to me, although they're old, not a lot of people would collect those, so the prices were probably pretty good.
Well, the prices were excellent back in the 80s because, as you probably know, the antiquarian book market is extraordinarily volatile. They can be up at one point and down at another. And I was fortunate in that my early purchases came really in the mid to late 80s. When things were actually relatively cheap, and also at that point I didn't yet have a kid and a mortgage and so forth. So I didn't buy a huge number, but I did buy some key things. For example, there was an early 18th century collected edition of most of those 17th century historians, which my doctoral supervisor had lent me his copy to work on when I was in Oxford. And a copy of that came on the market around 1986 or so, and I just knew I had to have it. So
and what was that one called?
Well, that was called A Complete History of England, and it's often associated with a bishop called White Kennet, who actually wrote a good chunk of the latter part of it, going up to the reign of Queen Anne.
But, so what did he do? Did he summarize the work of all
No,
these
he collaborated with an editor-publisher called John Hughes, who actually assembled all of the histories written in the early 17th century, or not all of them, but at least one per period. So he used Francis Bacon's History of Henry VII, published in 1622, to cover Henry VII's reign. He used Camden's Annals of Queen Elizabeth that I mentioned earlier to cover her reign. There was a bishop in the early 17th century called Francis Godwin who wrote a history of the Middle Tudors, Edward and Mary, used that. And so on. So he just picked one per period and put them all together, and Kennet extended it up to, I think, from the late 17th century into the early 18th. And it came out in two editions, in 1701, and I forget when the second one is because I've got the first one.
So how many volumes was that?
It's three large folio volumes.
So that covered off a certain number of historians
that
for
did.
a period.
That pretty much covered off, I would say, roughly half of the people that I was working on who were featured in my first book. Okay. So it was very handy to have. Then I collected another one fairly shortly thereafter. One of those historians who doesn't appear in that collected edition was somebody who wrote a complete prose history of England, largely drawn from other people's sources. This guy's name was John Speed, and he's better known actually as a geographer because he also wrote a work called The Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain, which is a massive collection of maps of England and the counties and so forth. It is hugely expensive because works of geography with maps sell for much more than the sort of history books that I collect.
Now, is that partly because they're way more expensive to produce?
Not really, because they would have been at the time, but remember they were produced 300 or 400 years ago.
Yeah, so lots of pull-out maps?
There's some pull-out maps, and of course books with intact maps are very valuable because there are a lot of books where we know there should have been maps, and the maps have been ripped out or cut out by some ruthless bookseller or owner, selling them separately as frameable prints, and we've seen that phenomenon many times. So if you have an intact book like that has all the maps in place, it ups its value.
Any other reason for the value of these things?
Well, I think just maybe more people are interested in the history of geography and
more
the history of science generally than are interested in the history of history. It's a relatively niche interest I have, but John Speed also wrote this History of Great Britain in addition to his geography book, and I managed to pick up a copy of that around 1987 or 88 for not much money.
How much?
I can't remember. Yeah, come on, it's 30 years ago, but it would have been, at that point I was a postdoc and then an assistant professor, so I wasn't making scads of money, so it couldn't have been a huge amount.
$200-300?
Yeah, probably that vicinity. I didn't get into four figures and higher till much later.
Okay. So your objective then was what? To get all of the histories of England written from when to when?
Well, I would say at that point it was just to get enough that I could work on to produce that first book and get tenure. I then didn't buy another rare book for a long time.
How many did you have at that point?
At that point, I didn't have the Johnson that was with my parents. I had the 3-volume thing I talked about. I had the Hobbs. I had the Hooker. I had the Speed. That was probably it. So maybe half a dozen.
Okay, not very many.
Not very many at all.
Okay.
Then around I guess a little later than that, I guess around 2007-8, I had a year of research leave at the University of Alberta.
They got a good library out there.
They got a fantastic library out there. Yeah, it's a terrific library. And was writing what became my Global History of History. And I accidentally discovered a couple of dealers that I'd been previously unaware of. First of all, biblio.com and then abebooks. This was a near fatal discovery. and not only did they have many of the secondary sources that I'd been unable to get in my area.
You just had, in other words, you'd have to have gone, as you say,
I did have to go to
libraries.
The books. I did have to go to the library. So suddenly I thought, oh my God, these are just right at the push of a button at the internet.
Are these early editions, or did it matter?
Many of them were, but I also used Abe to buy. I initially started using abebooks and biblio.com to buy what I would call modern scholarly books in my area, of which there are many, and which were not always easy to find. Right. There was one particular that I still use. It's over 50 years old, but was probably the most important secondary source that I used when I was writing my thesis. It's by a retired professor at the University of Washington called Fritz Levy, Tudor Historical Thought, and that thing was darn near impossible to find a copy of. So I'd actually illegally photocopied one just to have it a reference. But now with the internet and providers like abebooks, I could just do a search. There's half a dozen copies. Order one, and there you go. And then one day I wondered, and I think I was working on another essay at the time, which was a little more of my early modern interest. And there was a particular, I didn't have a copy of Clarendon's History of the Rebellion. Now, that, if you don't know, is one of the most famous histories of the mid to late 17th century. The Earl of Clarendon, Edward Hyde as he was born, was a principal advisor to Charles I and later to Charles II after the Restoration. And in the course of 2 periods of exile, both after the Civil War and then after he fell from power in the 1660s, for the second time, he wrote this very, very good history, which first came out in the early 18th century. It's a history of the rebellion, as they called the Civil War at the time. Reasonably well regarded by people on both sides, Whig and Tory, of the English political spectrum in the early 18th century. And I thought, well, that's one I really ought to add to my collection. So a 6-volume octavo edition of that came up, so not the first folio edition, which was still, up there in price. So I picked that up.
When was that one published?
Early 18th century, because the first folio edition, I think it came up fairly shortly after the first folio. By this time, publishers were getting quite clever at repackaging books in different ways.
What, with new introductions or what?
No, not really, just in a more affordable form, an
Sure.
octavo rather than a folio. Well, I should also mention that also by this point, I'd also spent several years shifting my interest from just writing about the historians of the past of that period to writing about the books instead. And my second monograph was a book that came out from Cambridge University Press in the year 2000 called Reading History in Early Modern England. And it was all about the reading of history books, the sale of history books, the marketing of history books, the printing of history books, the lending of history books, and on and on and on and on.
This reminds me of a conversation I had, and you've listened to it with Jonathan Rose.
Oh yeah, I know Jonathan, yeah.
About this history textbook project that they're running, where they compare the textbooks year to year to see what our kids are being brainwashed with, and how, for example, the depiction of a native person changes over the years. Did you get into anything like that, or not?
Not so much, because again, I was working with books printed roughly between 1500 and 1730. That was sort of my rough cutoffs.
But they would change them.
Yeah,
the
they
depiction of what took place would change.
They would, but I was much less concerned with the content than I was with what was done with the books. So recalling Jonathan's interview with you, he made the point that book historians have a different interest than collectors do. In many ways, we couldn't care less about that this was the first edition or that it's beautifully bound or so forth. What we care about is, are there any notes in it? Did somebody read it? Is there a diary or a commonplace book somewhere where somebody made notes on this book?
Yeah.
How did they appropriate what was in the book in terms of perhaps speeches?
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, if you're making a speech in Parliament or you're giving a sermon, have you drawn a particular anecdote or story from a history book?
Okay.
So I was interested in that. I was interested in the circulation of the books. I was interested in the fact that many of them came out in different sizes. And
why were you interested in all that?
Well, when you're a historian, things just pop up that you didn't know about that catch your interest.
That you want to know about.
And that you want to know about. So.
So you wanted to know why a book was delivered in different.
Yeah, and
ways.
who read it? So I mean that particular monograph, when it came out in 2000, was probably the most quantitative I've ever gotten as a historian, and that there's lots of bar charts and histograms and graphs and tables. Because I actually tracked, for example, subscription catalogs of people who would buy books in advance by subscribing for them. They'd agree, I will pay a certain amount for this copy. You could pay an extra amount if you wanted a special one on what is called large paper. And then also there's a wide variety of book auction catalogs from the late 17th and 18th century, because many people's libraries went on the market after they died, and these auction catalogs were a gold mine in terms of what I would say the distribution of genres. And one of the things they show is that history, which had been a relatively minor niche interest in the 16th and most of the early 17th century, if you graph the number of history titles available and on the market, the graph rises slowly through the late 16th and early 17th century, and then just starts rocketing up almost logarithmically after about 1660. And by the 18th century, it's become the most popular form of popular reading, apart from the novel.
So did you come up with an idea why that happened?
I didn't come up with an idea why it happened, other than just simply that success breeds success, and people were acquiring, I would say, and this led to, I guess, the sequel to that book, the one called The Social Circulation of the Past. People were acquiring a much deeper awareness of the past than they would have had, say, in the 16th or even early 17th century, when it was largely a gentry, clergy, and aristocracy interest. But by 1700, you've got publishers producing tiny little books for, the lowest end literate reader. Now, remember when I say that's still a very, very small proportion of the population that could actually read or could afford to actually own books. But the central point is that if you were a history reader in 1500, you had maybe a dozen titles or so to choose from, plus classics, Julius Caesar and so forth. If you were in 1600, you had maybe 100, at least on English history. By the time you get to 1700, they're in the thousands. Ranging from very, very serious works of scholarship, and now including that whole antiquarian line, to tiny little books that just give the potted histories of England, one page per monarch, often written in verse. So it's quite an interesting story. So that's how I got interested in different books, and that sort of rekindled my interest in resuming my own collecting a few years later.
Yeah, so what direction did the collection take, and how big was it at that point?
Well, the collection, again, as I said, from about 1986 to 2007, didn't really grow at all. Again, kids, mortgage, several house moves as I changed jobs a couple of times. But in 2007, I guess I had another phase of book buying, and again, I bought that Clarendon book. I bought a famous 18th century Italian history of Naples by an 18th century Neapolitan scholar called Pietro Giannoni, very famous in terms of the history of political thought as well as of historiography. So again, still a pretty slow acquisition at that point.
Yeah.
And then I would say around 2013, having now probably about 20 or 30 of these things, and having also established a connection with my friend Jan Frontini, who I've mentioned to you, who has a fantastic collection of his own of herbals, books about plants. Jan is a retired engineer turned professional bookbinder, and I was running out of stuff for him to bind, and he was enjoying it so much because he only does restoration binding. He doesn't do modern case-bound stuff at all.
So you were buying these unbound?
Oh, not unbound, but often in bad repair.
So he just wants to
rebind because collectors are often after something that's in really good mint shape. And I couldn't care less about that. I'd like it to look nice, but I don't care that I have to buy it looking nice.
You told me earlier you weren't so interested in content, but you are interested in
I'm interested in the content in that I decided when I got back into this seriously in 2013, and by that point I mean really seriously, like the collection grew, I would say probably tenfold in 6 months.
Okay, that was from 20 to 200 then?
Yeah, I would say.
Okay, what lit the flame there then?
I would say collection fervor. But again, collection with the rationale. I wasn't just interested in anything 17th century. You could have put the complete sermons of John Donne on the market for nothing, and I wouldn't have touched it. Not that it wouldn't have been a lovely book and so forth, but I confined myself very specifically again to history and antiquarian books, works that I either have worked on in the past or might be working on in the future.
Can you tell us what the difference between history and antiquarian?
Well, remember when we talked a little earlier about William Camden and his two books, The Annals of Queen Elizabeth and the Britannia, and we couldn't make that connection between the two of them. One was he regarded Britannia as a book of antiquities or antiquarianism, based topographically, not a narrative, looking at old coins, funeral monuments, and things like that, rather than the sort of more narrative texts that a narrative historian would use. Narrative historians of the period really thought that they, unless they were writing something like a late medieval or early modern chronicle, which is, this happened in this year, this happened in this year, and the chronicle itself largely died out in the course of the early 17th century. So most narrative historians were writing classically modeled narrative histories, almost always focused on a particular reign, so a history of the reign of King Henry VII, Bacon, Lord Herbert of Cherbury's history of Henry VIII, etc., even Camden's own Annals of Queen Elizabeth. Straightforward narrative history. Some were better researched than the others, Camden notably so because he used a lot of documents and archives that he had privileged access to through his connections with the court. Others just based on just other history books and earlier printed texts. The two kind of dovetail by the end of the 17th century, but nonetheless there are a lot of works that are in the 17th and 18th century about, say, a particular town.
But you didn't go after particular. You went after collections of histories of towns, right?
I did have a certain number of those, but again, because I had worked on them. In the mid 80s, I had a period when I was working a lot on the early origins of the use of oral tradition in history in the 16th and 17th century, and I published an article in 1988, which I'm happy to say is still fairly often cited in the journal Past and Present, on English antiquaries of the 16th and 17th century and their use of oral tradition. So that got me into those antiquarian texts, which I largely hadn't touched when I was writing my thesis, which was more about the narrative historians.
So again, when you went from 20 to 200, what was your plan?
Well, originally I just wanted to collect all of the books that were featured in my first book, The Idea of History in Early Stuart England. And that's probably 25 or 30 different titles. Then once I got those, and also various dealers had sort of figured out that I was an easy mark, they started pitching other things at me. So before we started recording the show, I showed you a copy of Sir William Dugdale's Antiquities of Warwickshire, which is one of the great topographical antiquarian works of the mid-17th century.
What kind of stuff's in there?
Well, it's a study of the great families of the county of Warwickshire, of who held what land, of the monuments, some going back to Anglo-Saxon times, some going back to Roman times, some going back even further, but of course they had a very heavily constrained view of how old the world was at that point, roughly 5,500 years at most, because that's what the Bible said. So things like Stonehenge, for example, they would variously ascribe to the Romans or the Phoenicians, and it didn't occur to them that it was basically a Neolithic structure, because those concepts were 200 years away from being developed.
Okay, so in terms of what that 200 represented, what was that?
Well, it grew to, and by the end of 2014, early 2015, it was probably up to 400. Because I then expanded the scope to include the late 17th and even into the 18th century. I'd also bought my first Incunabulum, which is a book printed prior to 1500, and that's a German chronicle published in 1481. But there always had to be a historical theme. It had to be a history book or work of some kind of historical scholarship.
But it
from the
wasn't
period.
complete by any means, was it?
It was complete so far as the English books, in that I achieved my goal of getting everything that I had worked on in that first book. And then I got a whole bunch that I would say a very considerable representation of books after 1640. But you remember I said the scale of titles goes way up. So,
so you couldn't be complete.
I could not possibly collect all of the books published between 1500 and 1800. Just the 18th century ones alone would fill 5 times the size of this room. So I started having to be a little bit more selective.
So you picked the easy centuries then, where there wasn't that much
for the complete collection.
Yeah.
But if you can get all of the stuff published in the 16th and early 17th century, that's probably 150 titles.
And they weren't that expensive.
They were not, with a couple exceptions, they were not that expensive. So I got some lovely, lovely ones. I've got a copy of the Summary of Chronicles by an Elizabethan chronicler called John Stowe, who had a long life. He lived from 1524 to 1604 and made a kind of business out of publishing these chronicles, just at the point that the chronicle itself as a form of history writing was beginning to die out in favor of this more humanist-inspired, straightforward biographical narrative. So I bought one of Stowe's books.
Sorry, before we continue?
Absolutely.
Chronicle versus the more humanist. Can you just define that
Absolutely.
a bit better?
Excellent. That is an excellent question.
Because Shakespeare used some chronicles.
Well, Shakespeare absolutely used the chronicle.
Yeah.
In fact, he specifically used a number of chronicles, in particular Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, of which I have a 2-volume edition in my collection still, although I've actually put that one up on the market for sale. Our library doesn't want it because it's already got a couple.
So how did you put it up on the market?
Dealing with a particular dealer who's put it on
He's Simon?
This is Simon,
Yeah.
Who had Simon has it up for sale, but I still have it in my possession.
Sure.
So he's just simply acting as an agent for a commission.
I see.
No takers yet, and I'm not budging on the price. So
What's the price?
I think I'm asking $18,000 US.
Okay.
And that's actually a mixed edition because I actually managed to find a copy of Volume 1 of it and a copy of Volume 2 of it from 2 separate dealers on the same day. Simon was one of them.
Simon who?
Simon Lippard from Lippard Books. I forget what his surname is, but
Sure.
And an American dealer whose name I don't remember, and I bought them both on the same day, so they don't have matched bindings, but it is a complete edition between the two of them. But I'm unlikely ever to be working on Holinshed again. I've sort of said my piece on the Elizabethan stuff, so I figured,
What again is the difference between those two?
Well, Chronicle basically is based on a medieval form of history writing, which is focused on the actual year. So there's no sort of common narrative thread. The chronicler would typically begin, either at the creation or the foundation of a particular city, and often use regnal years, like the 3rd year of the reign of King Henry III.
And this is what happened during that year?
This is what happened during that year, often with very little connection between events. The price of grain was high, the king wintered at such and such place, a great battle was fought, a comet flashed through the sky.
That's kind of a facts-based rather than
very fact-based.
No analysis.
That may be a little bit of an oversimplification because some of them did write more extended prose. And by the end of the Middle Ages, you do have chronicles, actually even earlier, some of the great chroniclers of medieval Europe, and including England, wrote things that, even though they had an analytic basis, as in this year, and this year, and this year, nonetheless, there was sort of continuous prose within that. So it's not quite as cut and dried, although 16th and 17th century humanist authors wanted readers to believe that it was cut and dried because they had an interest in establishing their type of history, which was based on Italian Renaissance standards. We could talk about that in a minute. They had an interest in making that look new and interesting and elegant, the whole Renaissance rhetoric thing about eloquence being really, really important. So what you will find in the early 17th century is a lot of authors of narrative histories repudiating and making fun of chroniclers as just concerned with trivialities, not concerned with great matter. They were often authors of low social standing. Stowe and Speed were middle class members of merchant companies, not gentlemen. So there was a very social dimension to it as well. But my point is that while the Chronicle was still used as a source, and continues to be, I've got a whole in my study, I've got most of the Oxford Medieval Text Selection, which is modern editions of medieval chronicles. But what had happened is they were no longer producing new chronicles, they were producing these narrative histories instead. So the chronicle had evolved, as I put it, from a genre in its own right into an artifact.
So you were satisfied that you pretty well completed what was available?
I completed the core collection, and I still have it here. But then I started branching out, again, still within the general zone of historical scholarship and historical writing. I bought a lot of French stuff, I bought a lot of Italian stuff, bought a huge number of 18th century histories.
And how could you afford this again?
Wait
a minute, though. Did you go from being a professor to being a more administrative?
Well, yeah, I guess that's also true, is that by the time 2013 that the big push on collecting came up, I was the principal of Queen's and earning a reasonably good salary.
Yeah.
The kids were all gone. The kids were largely through university at that point, so I had a little more disposable cash on hand.
What did they think about your collecting?
I think they were a little sketchy, but it's actually like, is this how you want to spend your money?
Yeah.
Our inheritance.
Yeah, that's right. Stop buying all those damn books.
They, as I said earlier, they made fun of the fact that I had gone from using Abe to direct to the dealers, and likened us to going from the street corner pusher to straight to the Walter White, if you know Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
And by 2015 or 16, I figured enough already. And then also at that point, the opportunity came up to give a significant chunk of them to our library, which had always been the plan when I left this mortal coil, but I just got a chance to make an in-life gift.
So how'd that work? You get a tax?
Tax receipt. It happened a little earlier than I have to say I was running out of room. I had 3/4 of these things in the principal's office at Queen's. I had to get a special insurance policy to cover them. I had some of them at home, but certainly was running out of room. But the opportunity to give what I would say was about 1/3 of the total collection at that point came up when Seymour Schulich, who is a very prominent Toronto philanthropist who's named a bunch of schools and faculties around half a dozen or so universities. Part of my job as principal was as a fundraiser and so forth, and I'd approached Mr. Schulich, and because we actually hadn't had any named chair or school or anything out of him. And he wasn't interested at first in doing anything, and we had a nice long conversation on the phone. And in the course of a phone call, which was basically a no, I'm not interested phone call, he asked me what my area of work was, and I mentioned the 16th and 17th century. He said, well, I've got a whole bunch of books I've collected from that period. Do you suppose the Queen's Library would be interested in those? Because I don't think my kids are. And I said, well, Mr. Schulich, I can tell you that the library would definitely be interested in those. And by the way, it's interesting, I've got a collection of those myself. Can I come and see yours? So I went and saw his, and Mr. Schulich's collection was small, but it was very, very high value. For example, one of his books was an early 16th century Caxton edition of the Polychronicon, And the Polychronicon was a very, very famous late 14th century chronicle written by a monk from Chester, translated into Middle English in the early 15th century around the time of Chaucer, and then one of the very, very first history books printed in England after printing arrived. And he had one of these things. I was practically salivating over this thing.
Yeah, but what an amazing coincidence.
Well, it was a great coincidence.
Yeah.
And Seymour is a very, very generous man. He decided that, I think he checked up on me. I was actually bona fide, a serious scholar.
Yeah.
Decided he would give his books to the library.
Well, the fact that it's a chronicle, like, did he have other chronicles?
Well,
as
he had a few
or?
other things. He had a couple of more geographical books. So again, it was a small collection, but I would say his 20 or so books were probably worth in combination about as much as my 300 or 400. Right. So mine was broader, but he had some really, really rare stuff in that. But there was a quid pro quo. He wanted to establish a really big collection at Queen's, and so he was quite prepared to give us some money to buy some more books. The quid pro quo was that I had to give my collection to the library as well. So we sort of settled on, okay, we'll give the ones I'm not going to work on again. So I gave roughly a third to a half of them in 2015
Right. Okay.
to the library along with Mr. Schulich's book. And there's a special reading room in one of our two major libraries at Queen's that is now called the Schulich-Woolf Collection.
Is that at the Jordan Library?
It's in the Jordan Special Collections Library, which itself is within the Douglas Library, which is the library you would have been familiar with when you were here doing your MPA.
Yeah.
So it's there.
I don't
now.
think I was that familiar with it.
So that's what happened, and then last year and the previous year I gave two other tranches of books. Last year, quite a big one. You obviously can't see this in a podcast.
No, well, I'll
the
take some photographs.
The collection you're looking at
Yeah.
that remains on my bookshelf,
Gorgeous.
I would say is roughly a third of what it was at its peak.
These are beautifully bound, though. Quite a few.
Well, many of them are. Many of them came that way. Others. I had my friend Jan Frontini rebind or restore. There's also another lady in downtown Kingston, who does book conservation herself. Her firm's
She's got a storefront?
Ars Libri on Brock Street.
Is that right across from Cook's?
It's right next to, it's a little further down, it's right next to the Kingston Olive Oil Company, if you know that. Just
I know Cook's.
very bottom of Brock Street, very close to Cook's. So she's done a few for me as well. But there are a few that are actually still in Mr. Frontini's hands right now.
So with this 400 collection of 400, what kind of work did you do on it?
Work in what sense? In terms of scholarly work?
Yeah.
Well, almost all of the books that you see, I will have actually written about at least, even if it's just a casual mention in an article or a book at some point. Some of them.
All of these books you've said something about?
I would say, yeah, at one point or another, I've written something about all of them.
About the content?
Well, about the content, about where they fit into the history of historiography. Some I'm planning more work on. So, for example, one of my prize finds was an 18th century history, the history of England under the Stuarts, by a woman called Catherine Macaulay. And one of my other areas of interest is how women first began getting interested in both reading and writing history. I published an article on that subject in about 20 odd years ago in the American Historical Review, and have done a couple of other things. I did one on Jane Austen and history, another on some of the 18th century intellectual women or blue stockings and their history. But Catherine Macaulay was a major historian of the 18th century who has been understudied. There have been a couple of books on her, but one of the reasons is that her history of England is very, very hard to find. And I found the only edition that was on sale. There hadn't been another one on sale for years.
Online?
Via Abe again, and sitting over there. And that one's not going anywhere because I am planning to do some work on it over the next few years.
So really, it pays to focus on an area of study that's, first of all, not studied very much. That's one thing, because your books the books that you go after as a collector, they're not going to cost you that much money.
Yeah, I mean, some cost more than others,
But still.
but nothing. For example, I mean, some books that you will buy, that are in, say, the natural history or something, will be in the high five figures. The most expensive book I own is that's not multi-volume, is probably my oldest book, and it's a 1476 Italian translation of Leonardo Bruni's History of Florence, and that is often regarded as the very first of the humanist histories that sort of repudiated the chronicle style of writing. Bruni wrote it in the 1430s and 40s, early 40s, and after him came many other Italian city-state political figures who wrote their own histories right through to the 16th century. But I really wanted to have a Bruni, and that one actually, ironically, came from a dealer not very far away, just in London, Ontario.
Attic Books?
Exactly.
Just interviewed Marvin.
Okay, well, Marvin hand-delivered it to my house, but it was so expensive that I won't disclose the price because people are listening to the podcast, but let me just say I had to pay it by installments over a year, and that's actually the last one I bought.
That did you in, did it?
Yeah, it pretty much did me in. At that point, my wife decided enough already. And it was fine because I'd completed my core collection, and I would say my interests have shifted to other things. And while I don't rule out at some point in the future that I might resume, the collection is closed for now, and I'm more in a giving away period than an acquiring. I think retirement's not that far off. We'd like to focus our financial resources on things like travel and other things.
Okay, so do you think we've got the story of your collection?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was I would say a long-term interest coupled with a little bit of disposable money and the onset of collecting frenzy.
So maybe we could get into, just to winding down here, advice to the collector, or to someone who's heard your story and is kind of keen to get into it. Seems to me that first off, a good idea is to pick an area you're interested in and study the hell out of it.
I think that's very helpful, because then you know what you're getting. I mean, for example, were I to decide suddenly that I wanted to collect, 18th century texts about Italian music. Well, I know a little bit about music, but, not enough to really tell what's an important book and what's not an important book.
And is that what happened with you? Is you did a lot of reading, but then you came across references to other books that were important, obviously, and then you just made a list that way?
No, I just actually at one point I just did a kind of series of word searches on Abe, looking for books published between certain chronological boundaries with keywords like history in the title, and that generated a whole pile. I had a whole binder full of titles, and I just started going through those, prioritizing the ones that were, from a scholarly sense, of the most interest to me. Okay. Yeah.
And then, so let's say you've identified a book that you want. You do the search, you come up, there's 7 of them. Why would you pick the one that you eventually picked?
So there are various criteria I use. For example, if it's a first edition, I might be interested in that. But sometimes the first edition isn't the best edition. For example, there are 2 editions of Holinshed's Chronicles, and the first one is actually very different from the second one. And
so you want them both?
Well, I actually wouldn't have minded having both, because the first one has one key distinction from the second one. The first one actually had illustrations. It had woodcut illustrations, which in the second edition completely disappeared. Shakespeare is most likely to have used the second edition that came out in 1587. But in that case, there was a second edition available, as I mentioned earlier, 2 different dealers, but not a first one. Other cases, again, Camden's Britannia. I didn't buy deliberately one of the Elizabethan or Jacobean editions of that. I bought the late 17th century, what you might call editio princeps, master edition done by a late 17th century bishop called Edmund Gibson, because that was the most complete, and it also corrected some errors in the 1610 translation that had been done by a more or less contemporary of Camden. So sometimes the first edition, if you're after the thing for the scholarly contents of it, is not necessarily the best one. Sometimes I'll pick an edition because it's got an interesting looking binding. Sometimes I'll pick it because it's got a very, very poor binding, but that I know I can get rebound or repaired by my friends. Absolutely cheaper that way. If somebody's saying that says reading copy only, that's as long as the pages are intact. It's, as long as the text block is intact. I don't think I bought anything where the text block wasn't intact, but sometimes, and this would particularly attract my attention, there would be something of particular interest in the book, like it had annotations.
Right.
So it's like so an Elizabethan book with Elizabethan or Jacobean handwriting in it is automatically interest, because you remember I have an interest in how people use these things.
Plus it's unique.
Exactly. I mean, so whereas I'm going back to your conversation with Jonathan Rose, we talked how a collector might not like to have handwriting and so forth in it. To me, that's gold. I mean, to me, it's an added value. I don't personally mark up books myself. I use Post-its, but I love getting a book that's been annotated. I particularly love it when I can identify the owner. And sometimes you can do that. It's got an interesting book plate. So I acquired, and I showed you this earlier, a copy of an Elizabethan translator called Sir Geoffrey Fenton's translation into English of a very, very famous early 16th century history of Italy by a Florentine called Francesco Guicciardini. Very, very important book in that Italian humanist tradition. But there were other copies of that. Why did I buy that particular one? Because it had a book plate of Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet. And I thought, I gotta have that.
Important critic.
Exactly. Another one, I acquired a book called A Collection of Curious Discourses, which is a collection of essays written by Elizabethan and Jacobean antiquaries, and then collected by an early 18th century scholar called Thomas Hearne over 100 years or so later. And I found out, and the book dealer did not realize this, that the actual copy of the book had actually belonged, because his handwriting is in it, to the very first president of the early 18th century Society of Antiquaries, which was a sort of a revival of the Elizabethan one. So I had that. I have a copy of a 17th century ecclesiastical history that belonged to Bishop William Stubbs, who was a great Victorian historian of England. He was a bishop, but also a professor at Oxford at various points in his life. And it belonged to him, and it actually has an autographed letter to him from somebody else, which I think just asks him if he can fill in and do the sermon on Sunday because the other chap's going to be away. So occasionally I'd buy something out of my period. For example, I have quite an interest in Victorian historiography as well. So Carlyle and others like him. So I found an edition of Thomas Carlyle's History of the French Revolution, which contained an entirely unknown autographed letter by Carlyle to the Victorian critic Leigh Hunt. So little finds like that.
Sure.
There's one I wanted and never got. It was an antiquarian book of the late 18th, early 19th century, a very famous one, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but it was a presentation copy to his brother. I bought a copy now in our library of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which had belonged to the playwright John Osborne.
Oh, that's nice.
Given to him by his fifth or sixth wife, I forget which. But,
So it really, the advent of the internet, you can't just go around and find these books by hunting through bookstores. It's the internet.
Needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done that sometimes. Now and again, I've found
it's
a little
pure
treasure,
luck.
but it's pure luck. I think, for example, the copy of Speed's History of England that I bought around 1988. I had a couple of spare hours. I was back in Oxford doing some research and just happened to wander into Robin Waterfield's, and there this thing was, and it had actually belonged to a famous early 20th century literary critic. Again, I'm having a senior moment and blanking on it, but again, I thought, again, interesting provenance, I'll take that.
So you told me, and I'm still having trouble believing it, that you've gone cold turkey off collecting.
I would say, I guess I would say that I reached a point where I had collected everything I wanted, and again, I had set some parameters. Also, I think I had exhausted both available funds and my spouse's patience.
How did you phrase that?
The domestic police.
Yes, okay.
Julie has been very, very understanding of this particular habit, but we do have other joint priorities, and including paying off our house. So,
it seems to me though, I don't think I could ever do that. I couldn't go cold turkey because I'm coming up with all sorts of ideas on what to collect all the time.
Yeah, well, I guess I've got lots of other hobbies and other interests. Discussed astronomy and photography.
Sure.
Occasionally I pick up a musical instrument. I used to play the violin, used to play the saxophone. Now that I've out of the principalship, I may pick up some of these again. And again, never say never, but you never know what may come. And I would also say I'm vicariously involved in collecting, and that we're still adding books at the library to what has become the Schulich-Woolf Collection. So once again, just over a year ago, we were able to persuade the Schulich Foundation to provide us with some additional funds to acquire a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicle, and that is a very, very famous late 15th century history, published in Germany by an author-publisher called Hartmann Schädel, full of woodcuts.
I saw a copy of that at a book fair, and it was Attic Books again.
Yeah, it could have been. This didn't come from Attic. We bought this particular copy, and I forget where from, because I think it's an American book dealer, because it actually was very, very lavishly annotated and illustrated by an early 16th century owner. So it was just a beauty, but that book alone cost more than all of the rare books I have ever had or ever will have.
Sure. So, but what you're saying though is that you can still search around, and if you find something, you don't have to pay for it; they pay.
Well, I could,
that sounds like fun.
The library's got limited funds, but I intend to remain, involved as an advisor with the collection for as long as they want, and who knows, they may be adding more.
Any parting wisdom
for collectors?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, you hit on one thing, which is, I think, pick an area that you're passionate about and interested. If you just pick rare books, period, it's going to end up as a collection without much connection, without much, I would say, identity. The beauty of mine is there was a finite number of things, and then I could add a kind of satellite circle of other things around it.
Halo.
But but I had a genuine interest in the topic. So if it didn't fit those sort of parameters, I could easily. It might be the most gorgeous looking binding in the world, but I'm not interested. Look for bargains.
Yeah.
If you really clever, you can go direct to the dealer. I'm sure abebooks would not like me saying that, but
the dealers would though.
The abebooks charges a pretty severe markup. I think it's like something like 6% on a book sale.
Yeah.
So if you can save, if the book dealer will waive that, and often they'll also do stuff on layaway. So I bought a number of books in 16. I keep saying 16.
Sure.
20 for showing my 17th century roots in 2014, 15 from a firm in northern England, now in either the Shetlands or the Orkneys, called EC Rare Books, and many of those I just bought again, like the Bruni that I got from abebooks on layaway. Just £100 a month or something for 12 months or
Yeah. It's interesting about this conversation about just being a pure collector or being a collector that has a scholarly interest in what they're collecting, so that the actual collection itself will be valuable to other scholars.
Exactly, yeah. And that was part of the goal that I wanted to leave behind eventually, and it's happened sooner rather than later, a really, really first-class collection of early modern history books.
Yeah, and it seems to me that if you're able to find a niche and then identify books that will be of value for studying of history, let's say, you stand a better chance of some institute wanting to apply.
I would say that's true. Yeah, I mean, and that's a good point, because a lot of these things, it's hard to give away. The market again, it's a niche interest to begin with, and if your collection is very, very indiscreet and all over the place, it's going to be hard to pitch that as a whole collection. You might sell individual books to book dealers, but you're not going to get very much.
Well, that's the thing too. Is most libraries, if it's in an area that you're collecting, and they'll probably have quite a few of your things.
Oh, they will.
And they want to cherry pick,
They will, absolutely will. So I still have on the shelf books that I have actually offered to our library.
Yeah.
But I would give them a list, and they would say, no, we got this one already. Or they, in some cases, they might decide that my copy is superior to the one that they had, and they'd take mine, I'd get the tax receipt for it, and they would then sell the inferior copy that they had. So there were, in just the tranche I gave them last December, there were a few that my copy will replace one that they previously had.
Any other parting words?
Be careful with your credit cards.
Very good. Thank you so much for the story of your collection.
Well, thanks very much. It's been just great fun to talk about it.
I've been speaking with Daniel Wolfe, who most recently was the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. You mentioned you'll be studying this historian.
We're going to be working over the next few years on.
Because you're continuing to teach, right?
I'm continuing to teach once I get back from my administrative leave. So I'm basically going back to the beginnings of my career and becoming a full-service professor again. Sub-teaching, some research, some service. But I don't have any intent of, at least at the moment, of pursuing some university presidency elsewhere.
No.
Since retirement's just too close for that. I want to finish out as a scholar.
In Kingston, where Queen's University is located. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Nigel.